Good afternoon, friends. I'm Joe Chuman, and I want to welcome you to our author interview series done under the sponsorship of the Puffin Cultural Forum in Teaneck. I'm Joe Chuman. By way of introduction, I'm a part-time leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture. I'm also a professor of human rights at Columbia University, and I teach human rights from time to time at Hunter College as well. We have a very interesting, intriguing discussion this afternoon. We're going to be talking about the autobiography of the radical attorney Michael Ratner. The book is entitled Moving the Bar, My Life as a Radical Lawyer. And I have two guests with me. Michael died in 2016, but I have two guests who were intimately involved with Michael and his work. And they are indeed very accomplished and distinguished. So I'd like to introduce them to you now. The first is Michael Stephen Smith, who is a retired attorney. And as it says in his biographical notes, he's been repurposed as a radio host and author. He was a friend of Michael Ratner's for 30 years. With Michael, he wrote the book, quote, Who Killed Che Guevara? How the CIA Got Away with Murder. And with Michael 18 years ago, he co-founded the nationally broadcast radio show, Law and Disorder. He served for 9 years on the board of directors of the Center for Constitutional Rights when Michael Ratner was its president, and he works currently with the Assange Defense Committee. We'll talk about that as well. Assange was Michael Ratner's last client. My second guest is Mr. Zachary Sklar. Zachary is the former executive editor of The Nation magazine. Obviously a journalist, he's an editor and screenwriter. He co-wrote the films JFK with Oliver Stone and The Feast of the Goat with Luis Llosa and Augusto Cabada. He's best known as co-author with Oliver Stone of the Academy Award-nominated screenplay for the film JFK. Zachary co-wrote with Marvin Barrett a book of media criticism titled The Eye of the Storm, the DuPont Columbia Survey of Broadcast Journalism. As a freelance journalist, Sklar has written for publications such as the New York Times, Geo, Scenario, and The Nation. He's edited numerous books, including the bestseller On the Trail of the Assassins by Jim Garrison, from which the film JFK was adapted. For a decade, Mr. Sklar taught at Columbia Graduate School of Journalism and was executive editor of The Nation magazine. He received his bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of California at Santa Cruz and his master's in journalism from Columbia. So I want to extend a very warm welcome to both of you, Zachary and Michael. Welcome to the Puffin Cultural Forum and our interview on Michael Ratner's autobiography, Moving the Bar, My Life as a Radical Attorney. I've got lots of questions. I'm not sure we'll have enough time to cover them all, but we'll get going. Okay, I'd like you to start at the beginning, and Michael does have a chapter on his early years. Can you talk to us about Michael Ratner's background, where he was from, talk about his family? What values in his family and background do you think shaped his early life? And he does talk quite a bit, I think with a sense of pride, about his Jewish identity and his Jewish background, and no doubt that being, I guess, is the child of immigrants, that in effect his Jewish values shaped his values overall. So talk a little bit about Michael, his background, his childhood, and his values.
I'd like to respond to that, Joe. And Zach, you can jump in after me. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Well, as Milton said, childhood shows the man as morning shows the day. And Michael's childhood is instructive in that respect. His parents were immigrants. His father came from Bialystok, Poland. He came to the United States when he was 20 years old. He was 5'4" tall. He spoke with a very thick Yiddish accent. He had to learn English. He started off as a water carrier on a construction site, and he became the owner of quite a successful building supply business. His mother, Ann Spott, was the 11th of 12 children, grew up in Cleveland during the Depression, extremely poor, obviously. They met. She was a lovely, very intelligent, competent woman Michael's father was extremely smart, and they had Michael. He was the oldest of 3 children. Michael has a brother that's 2 years younger and a sister that's 8 years younger than the brother. And they grew up in a fairly nice suburb, first in Cleveland Heights and then in Shaker Heights in Cleveland. Michael went to Brandeis, which was a school founded by Jews outside of Boston. At that time, he would stand in the kosher line for meals. He was one of the people that made up a minyan at the college. So he started off, very religious, and he evolved into something much different from that later in life. Zach, did you want to fill in from where I just left off?
Well, I think his Jewishness was manifested in Zionism when he was very young. The family was very Zionist, and Michael went to Israel as a young man and was very enamored of it. That changed radically later in his life when he saw the different situation that the Palestinians were in. But at the time, he was raised in a pretty Zionist family. But it was also a family that believed in community and in responsibility to other people. There were a lot of Holocaust survivors who came to Cleveland at the time, and Michael's father was very generous in helping anyone who walked in his door. And that continues with Michael and with Bruce and Ellen, his siblings. Their attitude was they had made, good. His father did very well with his building supply business. And of course, Bruce is a huge developer in New York City. But they have always maintained their sense of responsibility to others and to help those less fortunate than themselves. And I think that came largely because of the Holocaust survivors who kept coming in when Michael was a young boy, and he saw how his parents took those people in. His mother went and helped these people get housing. His father gave them jobs in his building supply company. And that, I think, really made a huge impression on Michael, and it guided him for the rest of his life.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I want to move on to his.
I wanted to add to that.
Yeah. Okay. Sure, Michael. Yeah. Go ahead.
Michael was a very charitable person. I think that gene runs in the families. I one time asked him, who do you give money to? And he said, whoever asks me. And he also thought that the highest form of charity in the Jewish tradition is anonymous charity. And He learned that from his parents. I wanted to also add that as Michael developed, and I wrote this in the introduction to his memoir, Michael was a Jew, but rejected the idea that it was racial ties or bonds of blood that made up the Jewish community, seeing those notions as a degenerate philosophy leading to chauvinism and cruelty. He rejected Jewish nationalism and embraced an unconditional solidarity with the persecuted and the exterminated.
Well, I want to talk to you about that, and I want to raise what struck me as perhaps, if not contradictions, in terms of conflicts in his values and background. I'm sort of intrigued by that because I came from a middle-class background as well, and his background seemed to be reasonably comfortable. I went to elite schools, as he did. I want to talk a little bit about his education, and then became radicalized at some point. So I'm interested in that transition. As you noted, Michael went to Brandeis and then went to Columbia Law School, was first in his class, was a bit modest about that, didn't talk about his intellectual brilliance and accomplishment. But to be honest about it, I'll use the word that, of course, is used frequently today. His education was clearly elite, okay? And yet he developed a sense of radicalism. And as I read his story, let me just say, to be descriptive, it was interesting to me. He seemed to come to it in terms of his college experiences a bit late. Okay, and I'm sort of curious as to what the influences were that caused Michael to basically, out of his bourgeois background, in effect, to develop a politically radical stance. Now, one thing that seemingly is absent is I don't, for a guy who is very intelligent and undoubtedly very well read, I didn't get a sense of an immersion in a type of ideology. During the period in the 60s in the left, when I came of age, and Michael is older than me, there was certainly a flirtation, if not an investment, in Marxism and socialism and economic justice through a Marxist lens. I don't get that sense. Michael doesn't talk about that. And I'm curious if you can talk about his radical conversion out of a bourgeois background and how, in effect, he ideologically invested his radicalism.
Well, I can take a stab at that.
Okay, do you understand where I'm coming from in terms of the question? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
And Michael was a product of his times. He was a 60s radical. Karl Marx, who also had an elite education and also came from a Jewish background.
Right.
He was from that generation of people that attempted a revolution in Germany in 1848.
Right.
They were called 48ers. And I would say that Michael was a 68er.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is you can't separate Michael's thinking from the world around him at the time that he was in school. And the world around him was changing very, very rapidly in 1968. You had the civil rights movement, which Michael knew quite a lot about and identified with.
Right.
You had the Vietnam War, and Michael was opposed to America's participation. What he saw was an American effort to prevent the Vietnamese from running their own country. You had the Russian Stalinists invade Czechoslovakia and stop the attempt of the Czechoslovakians to take control of their own country. You had an almost revolution in France. De Gaulle was so afraid that he got on an airplane and flew away. And if it wasn't for the reformism and hesitancy of the Communist Party, which was quite powerful in France at the time, you would have had a socialist France. So it was that kind of ferment and upheaval in the world that influenced Michael. And the last thing I want to say, and then I'd like Zach to help me on this, was when Michael was working for the NAACP. He dropped out of law school for a year. He came back to Columbia on the very same day that the students had occupied the campus. And Michael showed up, and the cops came, and they busted up the occupation. They sent 700 people to the hospital. They sent 200 people down to criminal court. Michael was injured, beaten up and injured. And I think that drastically influenced him, seeing that kind of oppression firsthand. The school at that time was building a gymnasium, and it was going to be a segregated, they had a back door for Black people at this gymnasium. And the school also was heavily involved in research on the war in Vietnam. And the students were opposed to both endeavors by the school. And Michael came to identify with the student radicals at the time. So I think that explains how Michael's thinking evolved. Zach, what do you think?
I think that as intelligent as Michael was, and he was as intelligent as any person you would ever meet, he was not a book person ultimately. He was a people person. And the people that he came in contact with at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the people at law school who were the people who were his best friends were the ones when he came back to Columbia and they were occupying the building, his best friends were the people who were inside occupying the building. I think, and then when he saw his friends being beaten and himself being beaten, it really did radicalize him, and he saw how Columbia treated them in the wake of those events. And he worked with his friends to defend those who were being prosecuted by Columbia. And I think that was really the way he was for the rest of his life. He wasn't rhetorical. If you read the book, he's not big on rhetoric. He doesn't care about all that stuff. He cares about people and what the effect of policy is on people and what the effect of law is on people. And that's who he was.
Right. No, that does come through. Again, I didn't see a weddedness to a type of dogmatic ideological position. He's interested in people, their welfare, their rights, and so forth. Yeah.
And also, he does talk about some of the contradictions in, he's wrestling with some of these issues himself, because some of his best friends from law school joined the Weather Underground,
Right.
Which he had some intellectual sympathy for, but personally, he was not a violent person. He couldn't sanction that in himself.
Right. Right.
And so he found himself wrestling with the contradictions in that, and that was true also in how he felt about someone like Che Guevara. I would think also that he was much more sympathetic.
Well, I want to talk to you about what we'll talk about. I want to talk about Che and Cuba and so forth towards the end. It comes at the end of the book, and I'm very intrigued with his position in that regard. But he does say that there was, in his own personality and outlook politically, there was a type of contradiction. On the one hand, as you point out, he's explicit that he's a nonviolent person, and yet on the other hand, he endorses the use of violence if he feels it serves a progressive social purpose, which would leave somebody in some sense internally torn. And he does say that his politics ran interference with his personality or vice versa. He's explicit about that, right? And I suspect that was a tension that he basically wrestled with throughout his entire adult life, throughout his career.
I don't agree with you, Joe.
No?
I think that Michael was not in favor of initiating violence in any way, but he certainly was in favor of self-defense. And I think that's how he viewed the world, and that's how he formulated his positions.
Okay, well, we'll talk about that. I want to talk about that when we get to a discussion of Cuba at the end, because I have somewhat of a different outlook on Cuba than some other people on the left do, and so on. But let's hold that in abeyance. One thing that struck me in the book, which was very nice, you talk about his being a people person. He's very upfront about his vulnerabilities. Very often he says, I felt anxious about this, or I felt inadequate to it, or I wasn't sufficiently prepared, or I was nervous before going before this judge, and so on and so forth. And here's a guy who's really super smart, comes again from a background which would leave one perhaps feeling more secure in the world, and yet one gets a sense that he was riddled at some point with some internal insecurities, right? And it comes across with, it gives him a sense of humanity in his personality, and I admired that he was open about that and very confessional about his vulnerabilities, right? I mean, am I reading that correctly? Yeah,
absolutely. Look, I didn't know Michael as well as Michael Smith knew him. I mean, they were very close friends. I knew him as a friend also, but not as well as Michael did. But the one thing that really struck me most vividly about Michael personally was how humble he was. This was a very modest man. For his accomplishments, I mean, this is someone who was #1 in his class at Columbia, who had argued and won at the Supreme Court level, who had been the head of this Center for Constitutional Rights for 40 years. He could hold his own with anybody in the world, basically, intellectually, and he had been involved in so many important legal battles. You would never know that from talking to him. He was humble. He wanted to know about you. He wanted to, if you met him in a room, he wanted to ask you about you. He never, pitched himself out there. That was not his way. And that I think was a result of what you're talking about. I think he never believed all the, he got awards. He got a lot, he got a Puffin Award, right? He got awards from Yoko Ono. I mean, this guy was very, very, he had achieved an enormous amount in the world. And yet he was still just a regular guy.
Right. Yeah, no. And that does come through in a very nice way in the book. Yeah. I appreciated that. He wasn't pompous. You need to get a sense he was self-important, that there was a type of humility and so forth in him, which was really quite lovely, I think, for somebody who was so smart and so accomplished, and traveled in such basically elevated circles, right, and so forth. Okay, let's talk about his actual legal work and so forth. Some of the earlier cases that he was involved in was through the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Okay, can you talk about some of the early work through the Legal Defense Fund? Do you recall?
Well, one of the cases was one of his own, where he had received a credit card statement that didn't tell what the interest rates were. And and this was, of course, something that affected a lot of people in the Black community. And
Sure.
so the NAACP Legal Defense Fund decided to take it on. And Michael, even though he was still in law school and was, not a full lawyer himself yet, they said, run with it, do it. And he brought the case on behalf of himself, and he won. They had, after that, Chemical Bank had to disclose what the interest rates were on its loans and on its credit cards. So he was also, when he was with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, he was sent down to Baltimore to work on a case there. And that was when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And he was in a hotel and was and there was an uprising, and he was stuck in that hotel for quite a few days. And then he came back, and that's when he came back to Columbia, and then and that's when Columbia was already in its uprising. So he met a lot of very interesting people at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He shared an office with Tony Amsterdam, who was one of the elite lawyers in the country who won the death penalty cases at the Supreme Court level,
Right.
and who later would be a very important advisor to him when he brought his cases against the illegal detention of prisoners at Guantanamo.
Right.
That was
Okay.
all part of what he did at the Legal Defense Fund.
Right. And then somewhat later, he goes to work for Judge Constance Baker Motley, who was the first African-American woman to be appointed to a federal bench. Talks a lot about her. Can you talk about his relationship with Judge Motley and how that informed his values? And there are some points, again, Michael's really upfront about certain points of departure and so on and so forth, where they're not always on the same page. Can you talk a little bit about his relationship with Judge Motley?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that when Michael was coming out of Columbia Law School as #1 in his class and on the law review, he could have gone anywhere.
Right.
This is a stepping stone to Supreme Court clerkship, then working for an elite Wall Street firm. He could have chosen to make money. He could have chosen to be one of those very successful lawyers. Instead, he chose to, and one of the people that he was was up for a clerkship with was Irving Kaufman, who had been the judge in the Rosenberg case. And when Michael read the decision that Irving Kaufman had written in the Rosenberg case, he decided he didn't want to have anything to do with him. And instead, he decided to go with Judge Constance Baker Motley. They had a really good relationship. She was a really tough, smart woman who should have been a Supreme Court justice. Certainly should have gone to the Circuit Court of Appeals, but politically it was not the right time for her. But Michael learned a lot from her, and she gave him a lot of leeway to develop and write a lot of the opinions that she came down with. Some of the cases he worked on, he describes in his book. And one of them involves the mother of Tupac Shakur, who was, the big rapper, famous rapper. His mother, before he was born, was one of the Panther 21 and had been imprisoned, and she wanted her own doctor because she was feeling that she was not getting adequate treatment in prison. And her lawyers came to Judge Motley to try to get her own doctor. Michael urged Judge Motley to take the case, and they ended up getting her own doctor for her. Judge Motley ruled in favor of her, and that baby that she was pregnant with turned out to be Tupac Shakur.
Mhm. Right. Okay. Very interesting. Yeah. He thought very well of Judge Motley. I thought that at some point there was a little bit of disagreement. He thought, he's always measuring himself again, very often in terms of degrees of radicalness. I mean, so and so is more radical than so on, and more radical than I am, or less radical, and so forth. And at some point, he felt that she wasn't quite as radical as he would have liked her to be, and so forth. In her
he had a disagreement with her because she went on a trip to South Africa during
Right.
apartheid.
Mhm.
And he felt that the politically correct thing at that point was to be boycotting South Africa, and so he got disillusioned, and he started to lose touch with her. And it was only later when he reestablished ties with her that he realized what a fool he'd been, because he had so much to learn from her, that he had been so dogmatic that he had let that get in his way and ruin the relationship. But in retrospect, when he was up for the highest award you can get from a Columbia Law School graduate, one of the people who recommended him the most was Judge Motley, and she said that in retrospect, he was the best law clerk that she'd ever had.
Isn't that marvelous? Michael, did you want to add to that, or did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I did. Michael had in common with Judge Motley, and also I think with Perry Rosenstein, the notion that we're here to protect the rule of law. Michael believed in the rule of law. Michael believed in democracy and the rule of law. He was given the Puffin Nation Award by Perry because of that reason. Perry said that Michael Ratner has pushed the courts and the legislatures to defend the right of citizens and non-citizens alike by protecting the rule of law. So I think that, in a sense, we confuse people by saying that Michael was a radical, because in one sense, he wasn't a radical at all. He was deeply conservative. I think the radicals today are the ones who are trying to overturn the rule of law. Those people who are trying to overturn Roe versus Wade, for example, are the radicals. And people like you and me and Zach, we're not. We're trying to conserve democracy and the rule of law.
Right.
And that leads me to ask you if I might talk about what Michael thought about the law.
Sure, please, absolutely. Yeah, I'm very interested, and it's very important. Sure, go ahead.
Well,
please.
Michael distinguished himself from liberals. He said the liberals' view of the law, because Michael thought that current capitalist law was villainous. And he said the liberals' view of the law is that the law is the considered response of a civilized society to the problems of reaching a decent and intelligent conclusion to disputes between the state and its citizens, or between the citizens themselves. That's a liberal's view of the law. Michael had a different view of the law. Michael's view of the law was articulated best by his friend Bill Kunstler, and he agreed with Bill. He said that the law is, in its fundamental essence, nothing more than a method of social control created by a socioeconomic system. And here we're talking about capitalism, corporate capitalism, a socioeconomic system that is determined at all costs to perpetuate itself by any means necessary and for as long as possible. And that was the view of law that Michael came to embrace in the late 60s and carried with him for the rest of his life. And that's what guided his actions as a lawyer. He had posted on his desk a slip of paper that said the following four things. He said, what are the key principles of being a radical lawyer? Number one, do not refuse to take a case just because it has long odds of winning in court.
Right.
Number two, use cases to publicize a radical critique of U.S. policy and to promote revolutionary transformation. Number three, combine legal work with political advocacy. And number four, love people. Zach, did you want to add to that?
Well, not really. I think that speaks for itself. I think, Michael, actually one of the titles for this book. You know, the book was written after, half the book was written after Michael had died. Michael wrote half of the first up to year 2000. And then after that, I finished the book by using his various sources. He had done an oral history at Columbia, and he had given numerous interviews, radio, and he'd written articles. And I tried as much as possible to use his own language. But and we had to come up with a title for the book. And I felt that the title that I thought was most appropriate at one point was Law Was My Weapon. That I think that that's the way that Michael used it. It was a tool of social change, and it was the tool that he used. So he used it as a weapon to in what he considered to be a social and political struggle for people's rights. Mm-hmm. And that was, you know, he was a lawyer, yes, but that was his tool. He wasn't you know, wed to it in it for itself.
It's very well said. Okay, I want to move on to a discussion of the Center for Constitutional Rights. And when I think of Michael, I think of the center as being really his home base, where he did a lot of his work that he was best known for. Can you give us a little bit of background on the Center for Constitutional Rights, its founding, and how Michael tied into it?
Zach, would you like to deal with that?
I think you should do it. You were on the board of it.
Well, the center was a product of the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. It was started by Morton Davis and Arthur Conoy, people that Joe knew, and Bill Kunstler, who Joe also knew. Right. The three of them started it in 1966. Right. They didn't have much money. I think it was Cora Weiss and her husband, Peter Weiss. They came up with some money they could rent an office. Where did they rent an office? In the porno district on 42nd Street. They had a walk up on the second floor, had linoleum floors. It was a sleazy place, a sleazy neighborhood, but that's what they could afford. And Michael, who could have had a corner office in a white shoe law firm, was extremely happy to work with the newly found Center for Constitutional Rights. Michael called them what Alexander Cockburn called them, a tigerish band of important people. And that's what they were. And when Michael started in 1971, 3 days after he started, Bill Kunstler sent him up to interview the prisoners at Attica. Right. After the Attica Rebellion. Did you want to talk about that, Zach?
Yeah, I'd like you to talk about it. He does describe it, and we're at the 50th, a little past the 50th anniversary of the Attica riots and so forth. And I remember being at meetings with Bill Kunstler after he was up there, so it intersects a little bit of with my activism and concerns. Talk to us about Attica and Michael Ratner's involvement with it.
Well, it was 1971, and of course, there was a big ferment, as Michael described at the time, you know, worldwide. A part of that was the prisoners felt that they were enduring, you know, conditions that were just not acceptable. I mean, they had a list of demands, and they took some hostages. They took and they had a list of demands, and Bill Kunstler was called in to mediate. Unfortunately, Governor Rockefeller gave the order, and they stormed the prison, and 9 hostages were killed and 30 some prisoners were killed. What happened is that after that, and many of them were injured. So a lot of them were in the hospital, the prisoners we're talking about. Right. And Michael was sent as a young lawyer. This was his first job. I mean, you know, he within 3 days of getting to that center, he was asked to go up there, and he was asked to interview, just go to the hospital and hear the stories of people and take notes and see what had happened to people. Because the state was bringing a lawsuit against the prisoners for the uprising, but the center was bringing another suit, which was, you know, that they felt that these prisoners had been unfairly victimized by the, you know, all this violence. And so they wanted to see what, get their stories. And so Michael was sent up there to do that. And then he later was sent to argue the case that they brought. Unfortunately, it went nowhere. And Michael had to learn as of his first time in court that he'd done all this preparation, and the judge just shot him down like this. You can't do that. And that was a good lesson for him, that this is where he came up with that quote from Lenin, that you have to be as radical as reality itself, because that was a big slap in the face, was seeing how radical the state had been in trying to impose its social control, and how the length to which they were willing to go, how many people they were willing to kill, and including their own prison guards.
Right.
And that was quite a radical reality that Michael realized was out there. And that's when he started to understand that phrase of Lenin's.
Right. Well, before we get into a discussion, which I'm very interested in terms of his transition and work in the international human rights arena, I just want to highlight a few things that are implied by what you had said, Zachary. In the 4 principles that Michael Smith read from the book, one of them was don't, as I recall, don't hesitate to take a case simply because you can't win it. Okay. And it seemed to me reading this that he lost more cases than he won. I mean, it seemed that he was always losing cases right and left. Absolutely. But in effect, I think he saw that as one of the principles enunciated, was that he saw legal work as folded into social reform work. In other words, he saw a type of partnership. They were twinned, that in a way that one had to engage in legal struggle, but do it in concert with grassroots social movements for change. And I'm wondering if it can just elaborate a little bit on his philosophy of social change and how grassroots organizing was married to his notion of what went on in the courtroom in terms of law. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Michael will probably have more to say about that, but I do want to talk about this concept of success without victory,
right,
which is the book that a colleague of his, Jules Lobel, wrote, which was basically, you're absolutely right, and you said it very well, that he lost far more cases than he won, but he was never afraid to bring a case because the odds were against his winning. He knew that, and he would bring them anyway. And this concept of success without victory was rooted, and there are 3 different examples that Lobel gives, and one of them was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who brought many, many lawsuits to try to get women's right to vote, and lost all of them. And then in New Orleans, there were apparently quite a few lawsuits brought against slavery, and all of them shot down. And then the 3rd example was Michael's own efforts and the center's own efforts in a lot of the cases during the 1980s with the Central American conflicts, to try to end those wars that were never legally declared by Congress, and they were all shot down also. But they ultimately all resulted in victory. Success, or not victory, in success, because what they were going for eventually happened. And they considered those lawsuits as a tool to publicize and organize grassroots movements to push for those social changes. And that was always Michael's intention, as you said, that he worked, the lawsuits would go hand in hand with grassroots movements. And ultimately, that's where the success came. It wasn't whether he won or lost in the courtroom in the immediate moment. It was what happened in the long run, that it was the result of this grassroots movement that he worked in conjunction with.
Right. So law was really a tool in terms of the larger struggle. In effect, it was one basically strategy and so forth within a broader context. Okay, I want to move, and I'm very interested because I teach human rights, and I moved from being an activist with the ACLU to working with Amnesty International, and then moving on in the international arena. And it intrigues me that the Center for Constitutional Rights, and Michael, that was invested originally in domestic civil rights work, it came out of the civil rights movement, becomes in effect a champion of protecting international human rights in the international arena. And Michael becomes a type of international figure in that regard. And I want to start off by citing a case which I sometimes bring up in my human rights classes that Michael, and I'm not sure this is true, says is one of the most important human rights cases in US history. Well, that might be an exaggeration, but he does bring up the Philartiga case, which I think is conceptually and in principle intriguing and up to the moment, because there was recently a case in Germany of you probably read about it just 2 weeks ago, the conviction of a Syrian who was part of Assad's torture apparatus, who happened to be in Germany, where there are a lot of Syrian refugees. And this man, Aslan, was basically tried and convicted and given a life sentence for, in effect, torturing Syrians in Syria. And what was employed there was the very interesting, politically fraught mechanism of universal jurisdiction that basically proclaims that a person who's committed heinous abuses, crimes against humanity, torture, genocide, and so forth, can be tried in any competent court anywhere. Okay. Interesting concept. It goes all the way back to piracy in the early 19th century, but it's something that Michael undoubtedly was very intrigued with and in effect employed. And so on. I want to talk about some of those more illustrious cases, but he starts off with the Philartiga case. And I was wondering if you could just talk about that a bit. It's very interesting, I think. Yeah.
He wasn't directly involved in Philartiga.
Yeah.
That was the case of Peter Weiss and Ron Copeland, who worked at the center. And
Right.
Michael talks about in his early days that Peter Weiss was always saying to him, put the international claims in your suit. And Michael didn't understand what he was talking about. And he would say, well, if you write it, I'll put it in, but I don't understand this. In 1982, they brought this case under the Alien Tort Statute, which essentially, there was a Paraguayan 17-year-old who was tortured and killed in Paraguay by the police. His parents, the parents of the young man who'd been killed, were in the United States, and so ultimately was the guy who was the head of the torture, the police, the one who tortured and killed this guy. And they brought a suit saying that under universal jurisdiction, it was legal for the foreign. These were none of these were U.S. citizens. That they could still bring in a U.S. court someone who was charged with war crimes that are essentially so heinous, as you said, that go back to piracy, that those could be litigated in a U.S. court, as long as both parties were in the United States at the time. And that's what happened, and they won. Mm-hmm. And that established the precedent. And then that Michael realized how important that was, because then he realized that he could bring lawsuits about what the Contras were doing in Nicaragua, because they were doing a lot of their planning was in Miami, Florida. And a lot of their victims had fled to the United States. And so he could bring lawsuits like that. He could do, there were Guatemalans, similarly, who had been tortured and killed, their families had been killed, who had fled to the United States. And the guy who was responsible for that, who had been the defense minister in Guatemala, was at Harvard getting a degree. And they brought a lawsuit against Gramajo, was his name. And they won. They won $47 million, but of course, Gramajo went back to Guatemala and never had to pay. But he used this many, many times. And ultimately, when they established the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, that was the one of the main things they did. They They brought suits against Donald Rumsfeld.
You're stealing my thunder. I wanted to get to
Oh, I'm
that.
sorry. Okay.
That's okay. No.
Well, the war criminals, basically war criminals,
Right.
that, and they did it under
Right.
the principle of universal jurisdiction, that
Yeah.
these crimes are so heinous that they can be tried anywhere in the world. Under international law, it's the responsibility of the nation where, that commits where the crimes are committed, has the first responsibility. But in cases like Rumsfeld, where the guy who was in charge of bringing those cases was Alberto Gonzalez, was the attorney general at the time. He was involved in the torture schemes, so he wasn't going to bring it. So they did it in Germany instead.
Yeah,
So,
we'll get to. I want to talk a
yeah.
little bit more about
Yeah.
that because I find that so fascinating,
Yeah.
and I do recall when that occurred. It's part of my memory. Could you say a little bit more? During the Reagan administration, we did have this horrible ongoing genocide in Guatemala. 150,000, mostly indigenous people, were slaughtered by a very cruel regime. Guatemala still remains, I think, politically fragile. And of course, in El Salvador, you had this succession of horrendous tyrants and dictators that America was arming to the teeth and so on during the Reagan administration. It supported. Now, Michael, it seems like he really became an international figure. He was going down there quite a bit, right? And supportive of the Sandinistas and so on. Could you say a little bit more about his investment in Central America during the Reagan years, or do you think you've basically covered it?
Michael, do you want to tackle that?
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, Michael made many trips to Central America. I think he made more than 30 trips to Nicaragua during that time, and he was all over the place. Michael was like Zelig of the legal world. Wherever there was a human rights disaster, Michael was there, and he was concerned, and he would bring he would try to help. And the center, again, would bring these cases. They tried to bring cases that would stop the funding, congressional funding of these wars that had not been declared under the War Powers Act. They had, Congressman George Crockett, who, they brought a case. He was their main plaintiff, and he thought he had good cases. But when it came to foreign policy, the courts were very conservative, and they shot him down every time. Usually on technicalities, not on the merits of the case. And so but Michael considered himself part of, the struggle for liberation in these countries. I mean, he was involved with Cuba, of course, and Grenada, Nicaragua, the Sandinistas. He was down there. This was part of who he was, and he says in the book that he considered those years the most sort of satisfying of his entire career, which is interesting since he lost almost all those cases.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Right. I wanted to move on. I mean, there's several big issues here that I do want to cover. Since we started it, let's talk about Donald Rumsfeld and his scheme through the Center for Constitutional Rights was to see if he could get the German government to arrest Donald Rumsfeld, our Secretary of Defense, right? And arrest him in Germany and try him for war crimes. Now, I must admit that when one stands back and looks at that, it does seem a little chimerical. I mean, did he really think he was going to succeed in terms of doing that? Or was it basically just to raise the profile of, the war on terror and the atrocities that were being committed by the United States, including, elevating or debasing torture to a policy issue? And Rumsfeld, of course, was one of the architects of torture and so forth. Was it can you tell us about that initiative, which I think is so fascinating, but one would say politically was probably doomed to failure from the beginning? Can you say something about it? Tell us a little bit. Seems like high drama in a way. Yeah.
Michael, you want to take it?
Well, Vince Lombardi, the legendary Green Bay Packer football coach, used to say that winning isn't anything, it's everything. Well, Michael didn't agree with Vince Lombardi. Right. Michael thought that taking these cases and educating and mobilizing and agitating people about the criminality of American foreign policy was everything. And that's why he took the case. It was incidental whether or not they would win. I don't think he thought he would win,
Right.
but they certainly mobilized a lot of people and educated a lot of people about what the United States was doing.
Well, they also started the European Center, which is a dream that Michael had,
Right.
of doing, expanding the work of the U.S.-based center to worldwide, to these human rights issues that he had become increasingly involved in. And the reason that they went to Germany was because Germany had a very strong law that basically said if under international law, if war crimes are not being pursued and prosecuted by the country, then if they come to Germany, we have to prosecute them ourselves. And they did this. The person they reached out to was a guy named Wolfgang Kalleck, who became the director of the European Center, because he had done exactly this with the Argentine military junta, in which basically they had tried to get the Argentine government to prosecute Videla, who had been the leader of the junta later, by threatening law, to prosecute in Germany. They did. They issued arrest warrants and so forth. And some of this was just to, tactically to put pressure on the local government to prosecute these cases. But it was also, these have some effect. I mean, Pinochet actually did get arrested and sent to prison. And you are not going to find people like George W. Bush and Henry Kissinger going to Europe very soon, because they know that if they set foot in, one of these countries like, Spain, where, a judge can issue an arrest order, they're going to have to be in prison. So they don't go there. So there is an effect, a practical effect also.
Right, very good. I want to move on to a mainstay of Michael's work, and I think I mentioned that I did interview him on his book, Guantanamo, and he did a lot of work in terms of defending the detainees at Guantanamo. And one thing that was an eye-opener when I read his biography is that in my human rights class, I do talk about those 4 Supreme Court cases that were brought against the Bush administration, basically in defense of the fundamental rights, including habeas corpus of the detainees. I didn't realize that Michael actually defended the Rasul versus Bush case, right? Which was one of them. That's a case he did win. Those 4 cases, interestingly enough, I found a conservative Supreme Court actually came down on the side of broadening the rights of the detainees at Guantanamo, which I think was sort of an irony. But talk a little bit, as you will, or as much as you wish to, about Michael's really path-breaking work at Guantanamo in terms of trying to secure the rights of the detainees.
Well, I can take a stab at that.
Sure.
When Michael realized that what the Bush administration was attempting to do was so offensive to the rule of law, he convinced people at the CCR, who initially didn't want to go along with it because these people were supposed to be the worst of the worst. They were terrorists, they were killers. Why defend them? And Michael said, they're trying to take away the right of habeas corpus, which is an old law, goes back to 1215 and early medieval England. And it says habeas corpus means produce the body. And the law that was won in 1215 says you can't just pick up somebody arbitrarily and hold them and not tell them what you're being charged with and not give them a trial. And the United States had tried unsuccessfully because of Michael, had tried to set up an offshore prison camp in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, that was outside the law. It wasn't going to be responsible to American law, and it wasn't going to be responsible to international law or the law of war. It was an offshore prison island, and they could do, if you can set something like that up, Michael really immediately realized was that you could torture people, that if it's secret and unaccountable, you could do whatever you wanted. And that's why Michael brought those cases. And in the end, he wound up getting 600 lawyers from law firms, large and small, left and right across the country to come in with him. It was the largest mobilizations of lawyers in U.S. history, and they won the case. They won the Rasool versus Bush case in 2004. Congress attempted to get out from under that by setting up a military commission court, which would deny the courts the ability to do a habeas corpus hearing. And they brought the Boumediene versus Bush case in 2006. They argued that case a week after Perry Rosenstein and the Puffin Institute awarded Michael the Puffin Award. And that case was won also. So that was an extremely important case in our law. And it set out a principle that the conservative judges on the Supreme Court wanted to uphold. And that was, you can't take our power away from us, which is what they won. So that's, I think, the explanation for the irony that you point out, Joe, and how these conservative judges went along with Michael on it. But, you take a case you don't think you're going to win, you take it 100% on principle, and sometimes you win.
Right. A pleasant surprise. His work on Guantanamo was really extremely important. And what we have, I think, discovered through the years is that most of the people who were picked up and held at Guantanamo for many years were not the worst of the worst. Many of them had committed no crime at all. They were just picked up in Afghanistan because somebody, in Afghanistan fingered them and had some resentment against them.
That's a good point. 600 people have been released so far. Men and boys, totally innocent.
Right. Totally innocent. Right. Okay. A few more questions. And unfortunately, I think we're going to have to bring this to a close. I see there is somebody, we do have a question in the chat, which we'll get to towards the end. In the concluding chapters, there are several things I want to talk about. Michael goes back to Israel, where he had been as a child, but his attitude towards Israel has changed. Obviously, he's lost his commitment to Zionism and becomes very critical of Israel in terms of the Palestinians. And I'm wondering, given the strength of his Jewish background, which was part of his family upbringing, how he basically transitioned seemingly so completely in his view towards Israel. I mean, clearly he was supportive of the Palestinians and was highly critical, as many of us are, of the occupation and so forth. But he seemed to have a fairly radical turnaround in that regard. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about his relationship to Israel in his later years.
I don't think it was a turnaround in one respect. I think his values remain the same.
Right.
I think Michael came to understand that what Israel was doing was frittering away the moral capital that it accumulated as being an oppressed peoples for 2,000 years. When he went over there, first to Gaza, they couldn't get in. Then he went to East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and he saw what was being done to the Palestinians. Then he understood that I've got to stand in solidarity with these people. And I've got to convince my fellow Jews that they can't support this, that it's taking away from our moral capital. And that's what he did. He helped found the Palestinian Legal, which went on the proposition that Palestinian supporters have the First Amendment rights. They're not an exception to the First Amendment. And they've been litigating cases for the last 7-8 years where supporters of the Palestinian people are being sued. And their defense is put up very often by Palestine Legal. So I think Michael was a consistent moral Jew in that respect. And I think there are a lot of other Jews who agree with Michael. And I think the latest piece of evidence about what's going on over there is the Amnesty International report, which is 248 pages and which documents meticulously the fact that Israel is an apartheid nation, and that's a war crime. And Michael advocated that. He was one of the first, but he helped popularize that understanding.
Right. Okay. Do you know whether he worked with any Israeli leftists who were critical of the occupation? Did he develop any alliances internally with Israelis in terms of a stance that was in opposition to the occupation?
Leah Semmel, the Israeli lawyer. He admired Miko Peled, whose father was an Israeli general, who's against the occupation. Well, who's the person? Jeff Halpern on the Committee Against Housing Demolitions. He worked very closely with Jeff, entertained him in New York, went over to visit him in Israel. Yes, he did.
Right. Okay. He does talk towards the end. Also, there's a chapter on Cuba. Okay. And I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, you'd written a book on Che and so on and so forth. You know, I guess my father was Cuban. He was a Cuban citizen and so forth. And I do have a cousin in Florida who's totally anti-fidelista and so on. That's not my viewpoint, but I am not quite as enchanted with Castro's Cuba as some other people, my friends on the left are. I think that Cuba remains a repressive state. My own view is that Castro's alibi that constantly raised was that, you know, el bloqueo, it's the American blockade, and so on and so on. I don't think that's legitimate. And Cuba can trade with Europe and Canada. Now there's a lot of trade with China. I think a lot of its economic problems are homegrown and are not a product exclusively of American boycotts. I think it's a very repressive society unnecessarily. And I was a little bit, Michael was a smart guy and certainly very critical. And my feeling was, and this is me talking, that he was caught up a bit in the romanticism of the revolution and was overlooking what indeed are the empirical oppressions of the Cuban state, which I would argue are not necessary. And I know, of course, it exists under the American behemoth and so on, and it's defied America. I was a little bit, you know, seemed to be a type of romantic, in the way in which it's described in the book, a type of romantic enchantment with Cuba. And I will say with regard to Che also, and I'm sure you'll shoot me down, it was well known that Che was extremely violent and took a particular pleasure in executing, sometimes personally, his adversaries. And again, I'm wondering if Michael glosses over those violent realities a little too glibly. Okay, I'm playing the devil's advocate here, but part of it comes out of my own critique. So I'm wondering if you can respond.
Well, you should know that the Vatican has abolished the position of devil's advocate. So you, Joe, stand alone.
Okay, well, I want to revive the position of devil's advocate in order for the sake of our interview.
You know,
I'm wondering, there just seemed to be a touch of romanticism that is just glibly
overlooked. I don't agree with some of the things you stated as facts.
Right.
I don't think Che executed people personally. I don't think he was extremely violent.
No.
I think that, well, you'd have to demonstrate that to me.
I'll show you the text, but go ahead. That's okay. We can disagree.
I think that initially the rap that Che got was right after the success of the Cuban Revolution. And the Cuban Revolution, of course, was a successful attempt, one of the only successful attempts by people to take over and run their own country. Prior to the 1959 Cuban Revolution, the country was run by gangsters, by a dictator called Batista.
Yes.
You'll remember from the Godfather 2 movie when Meyer Lansky, who's one of the representatives of the American mafia, celebrates his birthday in Havana, and they have a cake that's made in the shape of Cuba, and they cut it up. Well, that's what Cuba was then. The United States funded and gave military supplies to Batista to try to stop the Cuban Revolution. Before the Cuban Revolution succeeded on January 1st of 1959, 20,000 Cubans had been killed, 20,000. When the Fidelistas marched into Havana and set up their headquarters in the old Havana Hilton, which they called the Free Cuba.
Havana Libre.
Havana Libre.
Yes, I've been there. Yes, sure.
What they were afraid of was that there was so much hatred on the part of the Cuban people towards the Batista regime, and particularly the torturers in the old Cuban regime, that they had to somehow put some kind of constraints on it. And Che was in charge of the trials and the verdicts of these torturers. There's one story that sticks in my mind that's particularly chilling about one of the women leaders of the Cuban Revolution. There were women that fought in the Cuban Revolution, and one of them had her brother captured and tortured. And in order to get the Cuban woman to confess to things, the torturers brought in her brother's eyeball. That was the extent of the torture that was going on there. And I think that Che has to be supported in his efforts to constrain the outrage. You know, revolutions are excessive by their very definition.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Che tried to restrain the outrage that was existing in that society by conducting those trials.
Right.
Zach, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Well, I just want to read some of that last chapter because it talks about what the Cuban Revolution had accomplished and how it had really leveled the playing field domestically. In other words, the poor who had been, oppressed all this time benefited enormously from the revolution. A lot of the human rights violations, what people complain about, are not the people who were the poorest who have benefited from the revolution, but he talks about the land change, land ownership changing, the free education, the illiteracy campaign, which was incredibly successful, the free health care and so forth, and the number of doctors and their mortality rate being less than the U.S. and so forth. And then he says, yes, there were problems. The economic embargo, the collapse of the Soviet Union, increasingly severe hurricanes, bureaucratic incompetence, and some bad government policy decisions caused a lot of suffering and frustration. Discrimination against gay people was widespread, though that has improved somewhat in recent years. The kind of free speech, dissent, and elections we're used to in the US did not exist. But the priority for revolutionary Cuba has always been economic and social rights for all. I agree with that priority. I want to see children living in decent housing, getting an education, having health care, and participating in society, not begging on the street. And that's the example Cuba provided domestically. And then he goes on to talk about internationally how Cuba had supported revolutions around the world and so forth and provided doctors and that kind of thing. So I think his attitude ultimately is, yes, there are problems, but overall, he feels that the revolution has been positive. I think that's his view.
Right. Okay. Good. Two more questions.
I would add one thing.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, please, Michael. Yeah.
I would add this: that the intent of the United States, starting from before the revolution and continuing for the last 60-some years, has been to overthrow the Cuban Revolution and restore capitalism to Cuba. That's in the That's in the Torricelli law. That's the American law to overthrow the Cuban Revolution and restore capitalism to Cuba. We know what capitalism does to countries. We know what it does to this country. Michael was not a capitalist. Michael was a socialist. He was for the mobilization and the involvement of people in their own destiny. And that's why he supported the Cuban Revolution. And that's why he supported revolutionary movements in the United States.
Got it. Yes. No, that's true. Very good. Two more questions. And then I think, unfortunately, we have to bring this very intriguing conversation to an end. The first chapter of the book really deals with Michael's last legal struggle, and that was the defense of Julian Assange. Can you talk a little bit about that and his relationship to Assange and what he saw was at stake or continues to be at stake with regard to the Assange case?
What's at stake is the freedom of journalism, particularly the reporting on international issues. And if Julian Assange's case is won by the United States government, it'll be the end of free journalism. Michael understood this. Michael was Julian Assange's last attorney. Michael was representing Julian up until the day he died. Julian, as a young man, was a computer genius. Julian figured out how to receive secret information from people and publish it without the people giving him the information being disclosed as who they were. So he knew that kind of anonymous protection was what would allow people like us, citizens, to understand what their government is doing in their name. And we know what this government does in our name. Julian Assange was attempting to open the door. And that's why the United States came down like a ton of bricks on him. He was embarrassing them. As early as 2008, the Defense Department wrote a memo saying, we've got to destroy this guy, and we can do it by smearing his name. So they accused him of being a rapist. They accused him of smearing feces on the wall. They accused him of abusing his cat. And unfortunately, they were able to convince a lot of right-thinking people and a lot of liberal people that Julian Assange was somehow some kind of deviant. And that explains why he doesn't have the kind of support he should get. Michael understood from the very beginning that Julian had to be defended. And that's what he was doing. Zach knows quite a lot about this too as a journalist. Zach, what do you have to say?
Well, the important thing is that Julian is a publisher. And the United States prosecution would have us believe that he is committing espionage and aiding the enemy. That was what they were trying to pin on him. The fact is that the documents that Julian Assange published were co-published by the New York Times, the Guardian in England, Der Spiegel in Germany, and many other outlets. None of those outlets have been prosecuted as being guilty of espionage or aiding the enemy. Only Julian Assange has been prosecuted, or they're attempting to prosecute that way. Why?
By Trump.
Yeah, well, even before that, by Obama. The problem is that Julian Assange, like Daniel Ellsberg before him, revealed government documents, secrets that people in the United States really deserve to know the truth of. That's why Chelsea Manning, seeing what she saw at the time, decided to become the anonymous source that for WikiLeaks. And when WikiLeaks took that information, they were acting as a publisher who had received information from a whistleblower, and it was not edited information. It was the entire thing. It was the Afghan war logs, the Iraq war logs, and the cable, the diplomatic cables. This is what we deserve to see. These things don't need to be secret.
Right.
And the New York Times agreed, and so did the Guardian, and so did Der Spiegel, and all these other outlets. And not one of them has been prosecuted. Now, all those outlets should be supporting Julian Assange, and so should everyone who believes in freedom of the press. And Michael knew that, and he knew that that's what this whole case was about. And that as he knew in Guantanamo, that if we gave up habeas corpus, that was going to be the end of democracy. He knew that if we let Julian Assange get taken down for this, we're giving up freedom of speech. And that's what he really communicated so well.
Right.
And that's why he stayed with Julian.
Joe, could I just say,
please,
there's an Assange Defense Committee headed up by Noam Chomsky, Daniel Ellsberg, and Alice Walker, the Assange Defense Committee. And our listeners and viewers can get to that if they go to the net, Assange Defense Committee. And also, I wanted to repeat the title of Michael's book, because Michael's book is available from ORBooks, orbooks.com. You don't have to get it through Amazon. And hold up the book so people can see it.
I'm holding it up.
Right, moving the bar. Right,
yeah,
there it is.
It's called Moving the Bar, My Life as a Radical Lawyer.
Right. No, it's a great book. It's beautifully written. It's a nice read and an important read. Okay, I have one more question. I see that there is one question from a viewer that I want to get to, but first, a final question from me. When you survey Mike's life and his career and his achievements, what do you see as Michael Ratner's legacy? How should we remember him?
I think Michael is a model, as an example for young, not just lawyers, but young people in any field. I mean, Michael lived a very moral life. He lived a committed life and an honorable life of integrity. And he was willing to fight for the things he believed in. And I think his example is one that, that's his legacy, is that people can, and I think if they read this book, anyone who's contemplating becoming a lawyer, it reads that book, I think it's gonna change their life in the sense that I think they're gonna see, this is a way I could go. This is the way, I don't have to go to pay off my student debts and go to Wall Street and become a Wall Street lawyer. I can go a different direction. I can go the way Michael Ratner went. And I think that's his legacy, is he showed a way to be in the world that is honorable and that really takes sides, and that he that is an avenue for young people.
Great. Okay, before we sign off, we do have one question I want to get to. One of our viewers did ask a question. I see it right here in the chat. I'll read it to you, and maybe both of you can respond. The questioner is asking, what would Michael say about the never-ending situation at Guantanamo? There are still 39 detainees at Guantanamo. When will it end? Okay, relevant question. Thoughts?
Well, he did address that in his chapter on Guantanamo, because they won all these cases,
right?
And yet, a lot of people were released, but there are still detainees. And Obama promised to shut it down, and he didn't do it, and it's still there. And he said, "What's going to close Guantanamo? I don't have an answer." He said the detainees have gone on several hunger strikes to bring attention to their plight. He said they're saying basically, look, Obama promised, the courts ruled, and now there's nothing left except us and our bodies. So, I mean, I think he was genuinely depressed by the fact that they had won all these cases, and yet people were still there.
Right.
I think the only thing that's going to close Guantanamo is if this government gets the political will to do it. It's not going to do it on its own. I think that will has to be generated from below. I think there has to be a mass movement for democratic rights, including Guantanamo, and that's the only thing that's going to do it. Because otherwise, the forces that want it to keep it open and want to use it again. Remember, Trump said he'd continue to send people there, and he'd even torture them there. Trump said that. So that's what we're up against. Unless we have an alternative movement to that, we're going to be stuck living with the threat of Guantanamo.
Right.
And the thing to remember about the detainees there, not one of them has ever been charged with anything. They've been there for many, many years. They've been tortured, and they have never been charged or convicted of anything.
Right. Okay, well, I'm sure that Michael, if he were still with us, would be invested in the struggle, and many other struggles as well. Okay, unfortunately, we have to bring this conversation to a close. I think it's been absolutely engaging, intriguing, and edifying, and inspiring. Michael Ratner was a great man and truly a great exemplar of the principles to which he was committed. There it is. Thanks again. Moving the Bar, My Life as a Radical Lawyer. It's a good read. I recommend it. And I do want to thank you, both Michael Smith and Zachary Sklar, who knew Michael Ratner so very well, for being with us and sharing your memories and your thoughts with us. Thank you so very much. Take care.
Well, Joe, thank you for being such a good host, and thank the Puffin Foundation. Michael loved the Puffin Foundation.
I know, right?
As much as they loved him. And
That's
we thank
right.
him for doing this.
Right, that's right. He was very close to Puffin. Thank you so very much. Have a great day.
All right.
We'll see you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
You too.
Right. Okay. Bye-bye now.
Bye, Zach.